Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our workshop series on research data management. I'm not sure which number we're at, 6, 7, or Anna is telling me. Okay. 6, thank you. Without further ado, first we'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respects to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I just want to give a quick shout out to the session next week, which will be on DMP Assistant, Data Management Plan Assistant. And the following week on November the 7th, we'll have the evolution of genomic data sharing policies. So I hope you'll be able to attend those, and welcome to today's session. If you would like to become an Ottawa Data Champion, we'd love to have you join us. If you want to find out more about the Ottawa Data Champions program and how to become a data champion, please go to this URL. We have a bunch of FAQs there to help you navigate that. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Aaron Franks, who's going to talk about Indigenous data and open science intersection. So welcome, Aaron, and I'm going to stop my slides so that you can share yours.
Sure, thanks very much, David and Anna. I'll share my slides in a second. I just want to introduce myself here. Frankly, I'm not sure if you can see me once I start sharing my slides. So I'm Aaron Franks. I work at the First Nations Information Governance Center. I'm not First Nations myself. I'm Anglo-Métis. Some used to be referred to as Cree Scotch on my mom's side, a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and I've been working at the FNIGC for about 5 years now. And my background is in policy analysis and essentially research about research, how research can be done respectfully while respecting First Nations data sovereignty. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've enjoyed working with Anna and David, and I can't see the whole attendee list, but there may be some familiar faces. So to those of you who I've met before, hello, and welcome to everyone else. There's something on my, oh, there it goes, okay. All right. I'm going to slide into slideshow mode. There we go. So I think we have an hour with some of that time is for questions and discussion. So I've got quite a few slides here. I may end up going a little bit quickly, but I'll try to be as clear as I can. I wanted to certainly discuss the First Nations Principles of OCAP, place those in the context of collective First Nations rights to govern their data and to data sovereignty, and then talk somewhat about the intersection between those collective rights and the institutions of self-governance that First Nations are continuing to build, and the open data and open science paradigms and movements, and how there are both opportunities and barriers there to be discussed. So a little bit about the FNIGC, where I work. FNIGC's been around as a institution, as a not-for-profit since 2010, but the work extends much deeper than that. Back in the mid-1990s, the federal government rolled out a series of quantitative surveys on various socioeconomic topics, and they excluded First Nations people on reserve and in northern communities. So in response, First Nations leadership said, well, this is important information. We don't want to be excluded, but we want to do this in our own way, in a way that's culturally relevant and addressing the needs of First Nations people as they express themselves. So the initial regional health survey was developed, and there's been many iterations since. It's now 2023, and the RHS is still rolling out. It's been joined now by several other national surveys. To my knowledge, these are still the only surveys that are wholly designed, conducted, and governed by First Nations themselves. So FNIGC is a not-for-profit, and I'll tell you a little bit about our other work here in a second. But first of all, our vision is that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in alignment with its distinct worldview. And that's a pretty broad vision. It encompasses a lot more than the delivery and design of surveys. As you'll see, we're sort of everywhere at the moment, which is a wonderful feeling, but also a lot of work to be done. Our mission, and we assert First Nations data sovereignty and support the development of information governance and management at the community level, largely through partnerships. Of course, as a national organization, we respect First Nations local autonomy, and we're here really to sort of support as a technical organization. And very often that work happens through partnerships with other subject matter experts and networks, potentially like the Ottawa Data Champions. We adhere to free, prior, and informed consent, sometimes known as FPIC, which is very important as expressed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other international agreements. We respect nation-to-nation relationships, including relationships between First Nations and the federal government and between one another, and we recognize the distinct customs of nations. So our work, broadly defined here: education, training, and capacity. So we do education and training and capacity building in the area of First Nations data sovereignty, information governance, and information management. Certainly a key part of that are the First Nations Principles of OCAP. And since 2018, we've been stewarding the First Nations data governance strategy process. And that's a key piece of national First Nations data infrastructure that I'll address here in a bit. We do research. We do research on data sovereignty and information governance. We sometimes call that applied research. Sometimes we use the acronym OIDS around the office, the virtual office, the OCAP, information governance, data sovereignty. So that's research and engagement on questions of legislation, policy, IT and IM systems, technology, the cultural attitudes that are around that, the social attitudes around those and how they impact data governance and data sovereignty. And then with the rich material that the surveys gather, we're also able to produce a lot of subject-specific reports and community tools like fact sheets and frequently asked questions around issues of housing, issues of health, issues of the impacts of cultural connection and language retention on health, anything that's sort of associated with health and well-being. This is more, I guess you might say, I don't want to use the word traditional research, but research that you might be familiar with in terms of data collection, data analysis, reporting, and then stewardship of the data and dissemination of the results. And as I mentioned, we also have the national surveys. So that's FNIGC in a nutshell. So what is our core concern? Well, our core concern is First Nations data governance. And we take a very specific but broad view of what is First Nations data. First Nations data, in our definition, is any data that's from or about First Nations lands, waters, or resources. It's also data about First Nations, which may be considered in, more demographic data, quantitative data that tends to be associated with services, demographics, population. It could include administrative data, research data, certainly health data and medical data, and data from First Nations. Now, you might say, well, all of this is from First Nations, but we mean that in a specific way, that this is information or data that's specific to First Nations lived experience and First Nations culture and First Nations worldview. So that can include languages, stories, cultural knowledge about the land and space, songs and ceremonies, cultural objects, ancestors, and the related metadata around those important things. So where is First Nations data? Well, most of it is certainly not with First Nations. First Nations data is found in government agencies and research units. It's found in the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, universities, colleges, and other research institutes, including a hospital and other medical research institutes. It's in the archive, the library and museum systems and galleries. In terms of the government, it's certainly everywhere, but particularly in Indigenous Services Canada databases. And we estimate that ISC currently has over 200 different databases on First Nations. So data and data sovereignty. We have a situation where First Nations are largely restricted from the systems that other Canadians enjoy in terms of how data is collected, how data is accessed, how data is employed, who decides to collect data and use it for what purpose in the first place. And we frame this issue in the context of First Nations collective rights to self-governance and self-determination, which is grounded in sovereignty. And First Nations sovereignty has been long recognized by many levels of government, from the Constitution and through previous agreements, including treaties, and more recently through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which we'll talk about here in a sec. So in a nutshell, sovereignty is essentially the recognized right to exercise authority over one's affairs. And data sovereignty means governing information in a way that's consistent with the laws and practices and customs of the nation from which that data originates and which it is located. So First Nations data sovereignty in particular, well, data, we feel, is a people's collective resource. And First Nations as sovereign nations and rights holders have an inherent right to govern that resource. And these rights, as I mentioned, are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution in Section 35, in the Charter of Human Rights, and in the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But they're also inherent rights that First Nations people exercise and hold, regardless of how they're expressed in these or recognized in these international agreements. So basically, First Nations data sovereignty means that First Nations data, that's data from and about First Nations lands and waters, data from and about First Nations people, is governed by First Nations laws, protocols, and policies. There's a really rich movement, literature, community-level discussion around First Nations data sovereignty. These are 10 principles taken from the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative out in British Columbia. I'll go through them quite quickly here. Some of them may be common sense to you, some may actually be new to you. First Nations are not stakeholders, they are rights holders. First Nations are self-governing people, and they're not stakeholders in the sense of being a professional association or private corporation. They're rights holders. They're a level of government. They're certainly not a homogeneous group, and that means that data sovereignty needs to be defined by First Nations and by individual First Nations as well. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that data is not neutral. Data is not an empty vessel that can be used and can be interpreted and used in different ways. It's always sort of political. Data needs to be relevant to First Nations peoples and to each First Nation, and none of this is particularly new to First Nations people. What is constantly challenging are the systems, the policies, the legislation, the infrastructure that's stood up that First Nations people are unfortunately still often excluded from. So data collection is not new to Indigenous folks, First Nations people included. And really, data systems can celebrate different worldviews, including elements of traditional knowledge, contemporary Indigenous knowledge, and the knowledge and the experience of our contemporary partners. And we have to acknowledge that in order to work smarter and better in the future, that there's an entire world of tradition and worldviews and ways of looking at data as a collective resource, information as a community asset that we can really learn from. So I'll move on from there. The last one's really important here, actually, asserting and respecting OCAP. And we're going to talk about OCAP in the context of collective rights here. So if we were in person, I'd sort of throw open the floor and say, who's familiar with the First Nations Principles of OCAP? I'm going to move along here and assume a mixed level of familiarity with these principles here. So first of all, just a little background, the principles of OCAP, I mean, the ideas around ensuring First Nations can control and ensure access to data are very old and longstanding. It was this work in the mid-90s with the development and deployment of surveys that First Nations came together, thought leaders, political leaders, to talk about, well, what are the principles? What's the ethical framework, the governance framework that's going to guide this work? And this is how the OCAP principles came to being in 1998, actually. And they work on three different levels here. On the first level, I think OCAP in some ways is a framework similar to an ethical framework. It really establishes a sort of minimum set of standards on the collection, protection, use, and sharing of First Nations data. But there's another element here. There's really embedded in the principles a sense that, yes, this is good, but we're not just doing it for its own sake. That this really means that data needs to be used for the benefit of communities themselves in ways that communities identify, that others don't determine, hey, this is going to be good for you. The communities themselves are making that decision. And it's also really an expression of self-determination and the preservation and development of culture in terms of self-governance and self-determination as well. So what are the principles? Well, ownership. I'm just going to rearrange my screen here slightly. There we go. So ownership really at a fundamental level is about the ownership of data and ownership of reclaiming of identity and ownership over the stories, the narratives that data is employed to tell. And from a legal perspective, ownership is, of course, complex because we have laws that define ownership like IP, et cetera, and ownership over more tangible objects. But ownership in a legal sense is really about that bundle of rights to enjoy, have access to, have control over data. And these includes both sort of Western standards of property rights and also human rights, and also First Nations inherent rights and cultural views on ownership of collective assets for the collective benefit of communities. So data may be intangible, but it's still very much something that can provide benefits and can be held. Control is, I think, a little more straightforward. It's really First Nations must have control over the entirety of the life cycle of the data, and that includes the decision-making process on how and when and why data is even going to be collected, through how it's used, through how the results are shared, and through the end span of the data, whether that's making arrangements to steward it and govern it indefinitely, or making arrangements for its disposition or its destruction. Just checking my time here. Access. Access has got two really important elements. Of course, First Nations need to have access to their own data, and First Nations need to have control over who else will have access to that data and under what circumstances. So it's really not enough to say, well, we have a database that you can access, First Nation X or Y. So we've covered off our responsibility to respect the OCAP principles there. First Nations whose data is being held, we stewarded or warehoused, need to have control over who else has access to that data and under what conditions. And I think in terms of medical data and health data, that's clearly obviously maybe the question. Possession. Well, possession is sort of related to ownership, of course, but I think talking about possession separately matters still, in that there are still benefits and legal implications to where data is located that are a little bit different than the abstract notion of ownership. I can own something, but not be in possession of it. So if I'm not in possession of it, I lose a little bit of that right, that ability, maybe not the right, but the ability to actually benefit from or use that possession. Same thing with data. So in terms of digital data and the cloud, jurisdiction, the laws governing where data is held and secured, very, very important. And that's true of really all data, medical or health data or otherwise. So why does all this matter? It's certainly not just a nice to have. It's data and information more broadly really is a fabric that ties communities together, and it informs decision-making and good governance. So it's a strategic resource. Data is reliable, analyzed in ways that First Nations have decided that, there's goals behind this, that the analysis is warranted. Then data can strengthen the ability of First Nations to pursue their own goals. It can be more strategic rather than short-termist, more responsive rather than just reactive to opportunities, and generally more culturally authoritative, asserting control over, what are the priorities that we'd like our data and information to address. And essentially, there's, really a kind of virtuous circle here that good data governance promotes. Good data, I don't want to get bogged down in my words here. Good data governance supports good governance, and good governance enhances the ability to govern your data well. I think that makes sense, the way I've put it there. And really, this is not a given. So while governments like Canada are able to assert data sovereignty as a given, this is really part of a whole set of claims and ideas that are part and parcel of First Nations and other Indigenous nations in Canada and globally pursuing their right to self-determination. And as we'll see here, that there's a real infrastructural component to this, that the digital research infrastructure in Canada, including that's supported by the Digital Research Alliance and organizations like yourself, are part of. So let's look a little bit at the legislative background here. So Canada is a signatory to UNDRIP, and Canada much more recently has passed the law that solidifies UNDRIP as a benchmark or a set of standards to which Canadian legislation needs to aspire to or address. It's really a touchstone for First Nations data sovereignty. So the argument builds like this: First Nations have a right to self-determination and to pursue their own development. They have the right to autonomy and self-government. These rights require data governance and asserting control over one's own data to actually realize those rights. And this is really expressed here in Article 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. So this is about resources, this is about authority, this is about governance, and really the capacity in daily real world terms to exercise those rights. So Canada has committed to making UNDRIP a source of interpretation of Canadian law. And that includes taking a distinctions-based approach, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations, and exploring, in cooperation with Indigenous peoples, measures related to monitoring, oversight, determining standards, recourse, or remedy, or other accountability measures that will contribute to the achievement of objectives, which are self-determination and self-government. So what does this look like in practice and in principle? Well, First Nations are asserting the OCAP principles as an expression of data sovereignty in Canada. And in the health field, largely in the health field, but in other related ways, and more well-being and socioeconomic well-being more broadly, we see the Tweakin partnership amongst the 5 Unamagi or Mi'kmaq First Nations in Unamagi or Cape Breton, which you can find out more about there on their website. We may have people here from ISIS, actually. The Chiefs of Ontario or COO have an agreement with the Institute for Clinical Evaluation Sciences or Services, I believe, which is a data stewardship and data governance agreement. We have our own First Nations data center, which governs and houses and allows access to on a certain basis to all the rich data that FNIGC's worked with First Nations with at the regional level to gather for the past 20 some years. Other regional initiatives include the Health Information Research Governance Committee, or the HIRG, the First Nations Health and Social Services Secretariat of Manitoba. We have non-First Nations embracing, respecting OCAP in a lot of different places. Universities are incorporating respect for OCAP into their documents, into their principles. The Association of Canadian Archivists, for example, private corporations and not-for-profits as well, like Help Seeker Technologies, the Common Approach to Impact Measurement. This is not really an endorsement for those organizations, just saying that the OCAP principles, respect for First Nations collective rights to data sovereignty through the OCAP principles is being recognized across a lot of different sectors, including by the federal government, OCAP and data sovereignty being identified by name here. And for example, the Joint Advisory Committee on Fiscal Relations between the federal government and the Assembly of First Nations, the 2021 budget, First Nations data governance, or Indigenous data governance more broadly, but with a distinction-based framework was identified as a goal for federal funding. First Nations-led data strategies can further self-determination. And I think for First Nations, at least, one of the primary strategies that refers to is the First Nations data governance strategy. I'm going to encourage you at the end of this presentation to go to our website and read more about this strategy. But basically, it's a framework to bring communities together at the regional level to establish autonomous, self-governing, or governed by First Nations at the regional level, regional information governance centers that will have broad responsibilities for stewarding, governing, collecting First Nations data. There'll still be a national organization with a stewarding, coordinating function, but very much the vision is that First Nations, as close to the ground as possible, are enabled to, given the space to, govern their own data regionally. So these centers will have two focuses. They'll be serving the unique needs of nations in the region at a variety of levels, but also where data needs to be aggregated and services need to be delivered at a higher level or a broader level, collaborate together as a network of regional centers. And I think, big picture in terms of research institutes, universities, colleges, hospitals, the other computing, big data and research-rich environments that the Digital Research Alliance of Canada supports, it'll be very important to continue to engage with the First Nations data governance strategy. And I just want to drill down a little bit here further into the idea of collective rights. And it's really about understanding where you and your workplace are located here. So as rights holding First Nations, as rights holders, First Nations are in the position of asserting those collective rights. And if you work in a hospital or a university and you're not a collective rights holder, you're not working for, working with or a member of a First Nation or an Inuit or Métis Nation, then really your responsibility is to understand how to make space for and support the assertion of these collective rights. So who interacts with First Nations data? Well, essentially anyone who works with or for any of these sectors here. I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit here for the next 10 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a conversation. I'm also really interested, and I think it's really important to look at data and data governance from a really wide variety of perspectives. So we focused a lot on data as a resource, data as an area that First Nations have the right to govern, like their lands and citizens, and care for lands and waters and people. First Nations have a collective right to govern and care for their own data. And I think there's an interesting connection here with some of the more data science or data engineering specific concepts around integrity and ontology. And I want to just explore that a little bit here. So for those of you who in data ontologies, this is sort of new to me. When I think of the word ontology, I think of how people understand the world and what it's made of. And data scientists and engineers think of it in terms of the different components of a data system, creating that sort of world of how data circulates and where it's kept. And I think, to be glib here a little bit, it's more than just a sort of egghead concern or a tech concept, that there's a real connection here. And you can see how data ontologies can be mapped either, with a graphic or pen and pencil. And the same thing, I think, applies to how we map and build the space of our lives, including governance. So thinking of ontology as how the data world is organized and how the real world or our world is organized, both require a sense of order and continuity, at least for health, growth, and well-being. And when I think of the data landscape or data ecosystem, I think there's a real lesson here in terms of integrity, in terms of what is the integrity of this data system. It's ontology, how the world is put together. And of course, integrity has a sort of moral character as well, but it also refers to the wholeness or intactness or relationship of a thing or a system. And I'm not going to dwell on that because we could, have a cup of tea and talk about these things for a long time. But I wanted to just address that there are other dimensions to data governance and data stewardship in terms of First Nations realizing the benefits of data and governing, achieving data sovereignty in accordance to their own worldview. That rights and legislation are important, but there are other ways of thinking through data too that are informative. So open data and Indigenous nations. I'm going to refer you here to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA. FNIGC is a member of GIDA. And I like this statement here. It's not, what I like about it is that it's not shuffling open data and open science off the table completely. It's not saying there aren't benefits to data sharing, because there certainly are, but it's really challenging that very often the open data and open science movements are not fully engaging with the rights and interests and worldviews that we've been talking about here. So by focusing on the characteristics of data that will facilitate data sharing, too often power differentials in historical contexts can be ignored. And this really creates a tension for Indigenous people who are also asserting greater control over the application and use of their data for their own collective benefit. So open data and First Nations data sovereignty, I think historically, and I'm not sure if you could say this applies to the health and medical data fields necessarily, but I think more broadly speaking, in terms of the open data movement and open government movement, that there's been several waves that First Nations have had to navigate. The first wave is really about making information available on the basis of a right to know. It was really about cracking open government data coffers in the name of transparency. And this is where ATIP, or access to information requests, come from. This idea that there are holders of data and we don't know what they're doing with our data. We don't necessarily agree with what they're doing with our data. They don't have a right to hold our data. So we need legislation and civil action to access our data. But this movement largely ignored First Nations rights and authority over their own data and needs. Access to information requests cut both ways. First Nations often find their own administrative information accessed by third parties who really don't have any business accessing that information. Then more recently, there was the second wave of open data, which is where government said, right, there's something here. Data can work for greater social benefit and more efficiently if it's released. So very often there was a sort of putting up a dashboard or a data dump was seen as making data open, but often it was non-contextual, out of context, that the data may not have been relevant, that it was not necessarily put together in a way that was analyzable. And again, it largely ignored First Nations rights, authority, and needs, in that, open data dumps, First Nations don't have the capacity to sift through that kind of data. And also, again, ignoring the fact that if First Nations data is held by the federal government or another body, they don't have the right to open that data to just anyone. And I think more recently, we're maybe familiar with this phrase, publish with purpose. And I think there's opportunity here. Still a long ways to go in terms of working together respectfully. But the idea here with open data is that it's not dumping data publicly and saying, right, we've done our duty, the data is open. It's working with rights holders and stakeholders to understand where data is, who it's valuable to, and how it can be made useful. So publish with purpose, I think, is essentially, we have all this data, but we need to work together with the rights holders and stakeholders who can benefit from it. First of all, make them aware that it's there, and create outputs that meet the needs of stakeholders and rights holders, as opposed to just a data dump. So this is about governance and collaboration, data sharing, research collaborations, data collaboratives, whether that involves different corporations, different levels of government. Of course, it still raises lots of questions. These things won't operate in the public interest. Will which publics? And again, I think we need to always remember here that First Nations and other Indigenous nations are not simply stakeholders. We're not a professional association. We're not researchers or students. We are self-governing, self-determining peoples who have a collective right, like other levels of government do, to determine how the data is going to be used. So I want to sort of land on some contemporary real-world examples of problems and opportunities here as well. And there's a lot of text here, but the upshot is that jurisdictions, organizations are attempting to address these questions. There's still a lot left, a lot of work left to be done, and a sense that this topic is a bit of a hot potato and that people don't quite know what to do with it. And when I say that, I mean that there's a discursive sense that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have the right to self-determination that includes data governance. But where the rubber hits the road around how First Nations and other Indigenous nations are going to be able to realize that right, it gets very foggy. So for example, we've got unfortunately a great example here. The Office of the Chief Science Advisor's roadmap on open science has this to say. It basically refers people back to other federal documents. It says a federal approach to supporting Indigenous data strategies is outlined in the Federal Civil Service Data Strategy Roadmap, Recommendation 8. For this reason, the Chief Science Advisor was not going to explicitly address Indigenous rights when it comes to open science. And I think open science definitely maps onto what we're talking about here. So if you refer to that Recommendation 8, essentially the goal is determine data strategies jointly with Indigenous partners. So we have a kind of, I hate to say, a little bit of a buck passing here, where federal guidelines on open science refer back to the civil services guidance on open data and data governance, which basically says we need to work together with Indigenous partners. So where is the work actually happening? Where is the funding for that? Where is the acknowledgement of how far we have to go? Well, I think it's safe to say that this audience here can have an impact there, a really positive impact. And I don't mean to single out the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, because certainly this is a complex question, but we see how digital research infrastructure, not just health and medical data, is being stood up, but there are processes going on where policy and practice is being created, I think, in a fairly quick hurry, given how significant the implications are, happening in a fairly quick hurry, where we've got the central agencies of the government working with the tri-agencies, who are then supporting and collaborating with third parties, not government agencies, but third parties like TRAC to stand up this infrastructure. So we have a multi-year funding proposal, which it's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people were not invited to shape. We have the Alliance working with the tri-agencies on the development of data management strategies and data management plans, not developing them, but creating the environment where those things are going to get developed. Again, very little First Nations input there. And we have a variety of web training programs, workshops, and resources being developed for universities and colleges and research institutes for data management plans, without significant engagement with First Nations on how that's going to happen. Now, this program, the people I'm speaking with here, you could say, well, this is a moment in time where we're going to address that, right? The Digital Research Alliance has given small amounts of money to a series of data champion teams across the country. And that's fantastic. And you've invited me here to speak, and I'm very, very happy to do so. I'm really looking forward to some questions. But if we look at the schedule, we notice that 2 of 14, or 1 in 7 of these presentations is addressing data, Indigenous data and data governance. And I'm imagining in other presentations, there's reference to the need to work with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Now, if this is being repeated across the country, we can see there's a real appetite in the, and with this group, the medical and health data community, to understand how they can better respect Indigenous rights in this area over health and medical data. So how are we going to have the resources to promote this collaboration and this conversation? Well, I have some suggestions for you. First of all, I would suggest, at least in the First Nations context, making yourself familiar with the First Nations data governance strategy, in terms of watching and supporting where you can this infrastructure grow, where First Nations will have the technical capacity and the governance authority to work on these questions at a community and regional level, rather than having someone from the national office do a presentation. I'm going to recommend the Fundamentals of Workshop course that we offer online. It's an excellent course. It's been taken by a few thousand people at this point. And I want to say that we've revised it, and the latest version will be out in February or March. So if you want to hang on and take it then, you could do that. I think it's going to be a significantly improved and richer course. I invite you to talk to us about the recent funding we received from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, or CIHR, on a project called the First Nations Feasibility Study on Biobanking and Genomic Research. I'm happy to, maybe if you're curious about it, I invite you to maybe email me later, and I can direct you to folks in our organization about that. This would be a real way to have this Data Champions Network work with our networks, our staff, our advisory committee in this really important area, but I have to say is fairly new for us, genomic and biological data. And then I would suggest, speak to the Digital Research Alliance and to your own workplaces and find out, how you, in what other ways are you working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, governments, and service organizations in this area, and really look at directing resources to us as partners to have this conversation in a fulsome, collaborative way. And I believe it's 11:15, and I'm going to wind up there. And I really thank you for your time. I know I went fairly quickly. I'm a little bit nervous, and there was a lot of text there, so I appreciate your attention and your patience with me. Thanks very much. Miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. It was a fantastic talk, and I certainly learned plenty. I think
should I stop sharing?
Yes, you can, Aaron. Okay, that's excellent. Just to remind people that they can put questions in the chat, or they can open their mic and speak directly to Aaron. Aaron, there's there is a question from Alexander Thistlewood. In one of your later slides, he's asking, the items crossed out indicate that Indigenous participation was lacking in their development. Yes? He's with a question mark.
Yes, Alexander.
Alexander himself.
Thank you for that question. I was a little hesitant to use the strikeout font, and I was not the best visual. I wish I had more time to do something a little more sophisticated, but you know, we've worked with, and again, this is not to stand on a bully pulpit about the Alliance, but it really is a significant organization, and we really see a significant move in terms of financial investment and standing up the infrastructure there. So I think it's really fair to lay all this on the table. Yeah, I mean the multi-year funding proposal, which it's a little technical acronym there, is the Alliance's process on determining funding priorities for the next couple of years. And to my knowledge, I think the engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people was very haphazard and very ad hoc, and maybe happened at the level of, if it happened at all, it would have been at the level of receiving project-based proposals from individuals rather than taking a more structural or nation-to-nation approach. And the same happened, we see, with the Tri-Council, the tri-agencies, and the way that tri-agencies are standing up the requirements for data management strategies and data management plans. And the Alliance and others are, well, largely the Alliance, are funding, encouraging the development of these tools, which will have a huge impact on First Nations data sovereignty, the way research is, the way data is governed, stored, stewarded, without, again, input from, certainly not from FNIGC, and to my understanding, not from other rights organizations that represent rights-holding Indigenous folk either. Now, we have a very cordial relationship with the Alliance in a lot of ways, but it's a big beast, right? It's a very big beast, and I think there's a long way to go in terms of funding and supporting and putting in the time to develop, to co-create and collaborate, like the law requires, essentially, this sort of infrastructure.
Thank you. I see Alexander is nodding, so hopefully, I think that implies he's addressed your question. I think Niha Milan, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, wants to make sure that the links will be shared. But I think what we do, Aaron, is we record everything, and the links are in the documentation, so you'll see that. Niha, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Aaron, I wanted to ask you a question, because I see there's no other questions immediately. So let's supposing I've done a study that has involved, for argument's sake, 1,000 people, and it's a study. It could be a randomized trial looking whether a particular treatment is effective. It could be a survey asking people what's their view of gender reassignment surgery. And of those 1,000 people, let's say there's 100 people who are from First Nations, and I want to share the data from this study. Do I, in a sense, as a researcher, do I have a permission to do that in terms of I have First Nations people in that study, or do I need to go about getting permission or doing the data sharing in a different way? Well,
that's actually that's one large question with, I think, a few elements to it, David, and some of it is methodological, and some of it is really the sort of the a bit more foundational about what is the purpose of research and what is the social benefit of it, and why was this research being conducted. I think there is a governance question that First Nations are working on, and there's a lot of barriers to resolving this question about, I think I'm addressing a little bit also Leonore Ward's question in the chat about identification, how Indigenous patients may or may not identify themselves when they intersect with the health system. But David, it sounds like you're talking about you're not talking about data collected in a treatment context. You're talking about a specific research where primary research was done, where people's consent was sought.
Yes. Yes, so in a sense that the 1,000 people would be treated in quotes in equal, in that we would seek out ethics approval, et cetera, to do the study, and it would be approved. But as I'm learning more about the importance of, for example, First Nations and their ownership of their data, I'm sort of wondering about, okay, I've done this study, and in this study in this research study there are some people from First Nations, and I'm wondering, can I share all of the data, or do I need to do something? Do I need to do something different with the people who are from the First Nations who participated in this research study?
Well, I think that there's a couple of questions here, and one is the general question about protecting individual privacy, which would apply to anybody in the study. But let's assume that that's taken care of. But I just raised it because it's still a concern for the First Nations folk as well. I think it's about, there's not a cut and dry answer, because different research designs will expose the data of contributing individuals in different ways. So I can provide a sort of more of an overview answer. If with the numbers you're giving, we're talking about 1 in 10 participants. I think there's a really strong argument there to say this is not, in an urban setting where and maybe the design is such that you're not using many different identifiers. I don't know. But to have 100 out of 1,000 people, I think it's about deciding, and where that line is, I don't quite know, to say there's a significant there's a significant number of participants here who are First Nations, and that's significant in two ways. It's how are you presenting those outcomes? Is it important in your study that these people are First Nations? Is there a connection to be made about health outcomes or whatever there that's specific? And how your responsibility there to share that information with First Nations so that they can participate in making those decisions about, this is a significant finding. We may be able to use this finding in designing our own programs and seeking funding for our own programs, and being better able to support our people. And the Tweakin partnership is a great example of that, where anecdotal evidence about health outcomes, they said, well, we don't want the anecdotal evidence anymore. We want the statistics and the research results to help support our arguments as we build our health system. So there's an outcome-based argument there, where the significant impacts for First Nations people warrant you working with First Nations governments, service organizations, to make them aware of these findings. In terms of capturing the data itself, well, it really depends on how have you asked people to identify themselves. And that maybe sounds like a dodge to the question, but I actually think it's an important consideration in research design. So it's kind of difficult, David, to answer a question like that without knowing more about the design, the intention of the intentionality, and the plans to disseminate the research.
Okay. No, I hear you, Aaron, and I thank you. And I think it just says to me that in terms of any data management plan that we're developing, whether it's for randomized trials or surveys, we actually probably need to be collaborating with First Nations people to, even if it's only a bullet or two, that may be specific. We need to do that. That's really, really important.
And I think one of the reasons I brought up the First Nations data governance strategy in that list of organizations, First Nations that are already, is that some of those partnerships, those pathways exist, but we need more of them. We need more of the collaboration you're talking about. Yeah.
I don't know, Leonor, whether our conversation answered your question or not, but maybe you can let us know. I think I'm also conscious of the time. There's only 3 minutes left, and I know that some people will have to get off smartly at 11 o'clock to be going to some other meeting. So Vivian is thanking you. Leonor is asking, I wonder if one could identify when we get our health card. I'm not sure I understand that question, but maybe you do, Aaron.
Well, I'm there. I think, you know, your first comment, Leonor, it's very tricky because individual First Nations have their own protocols and laws around membership. And I know that many First Nations are working really hard to extend services and data collection to people who live away from home, live off reserve. That's really a matter of kind of capacity and First Nations collaborating together, you know, with the proper resources and funding. As to the second question about identifying when we get our health card, again, I think that's a really complex question. How one identifies on your health card, there's implications there that are complicated. But your point about how do Indigenous people identify in the healthcare system, and how does that, and if they identify, how does that knowledge become useful to improve better health outcomes for Indigenous people, rather than just being sort of an aggregate which loses the Indigenous experience, is important. I don't know how to answer your question about the health card. I think there's a lot to unpack there around ID and identity.
Thank you again so much, Aaron. It was a really great session, and I hope people connect with you. I think you can be sure that Anna and I will. So just wishing you, Aaron, a great day, and everybody else who's able to join us. Thank you so much, and take care and have a great rest of the day. So thank you again, Aaron.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks very much for your time.
Bye.